Welcome everybody, this is Grandmaster Alex Lenderman with the second part of this video series on the topic of playing with and against hanging pawns. And in the previous video I discussed how the side with hanging pawns would either create initiative or an attack, or sometimes they would play in a defensive way with hanging pawns when there is no chance to get an attack. In this video, we're going to show how the side who plays against the hanging pawns can do it very successfully. So first we're going to look at the game between Tigran Petrosian, the 9th world champion, and Hort Vlastimil, also a top player of that time. So knight f3, c5, b3, d5. Now first important moment is e3, because if we go bishop b2, then black can play f6, trying to play e5, and black gets a very good game. So that's why the important move is to play e3, and now if black were to play f6, white can play d4 and more or less not allow e5, and now f6 is only a weakness which takes away a square from the knight. So black played knight f6, white played bishop b2, and now we're getting a normal reversed Queen's Indian with a fin-carried bishop, e6, c4, knight c6, cd, ed, bishop e2, bishop e7. Maybe bishop d6 is more logical, since eventually white will play d4 and get a position involving black having either an isolated pawn or hanging pawns. And he wants to have the bishop on an active square, putting pressure on h2, as we've seen in a lot of previous videos. But he played the more passive defensive bishop e7, and now after castles d4, white gets a pretty good version of an isolated pawn. So black played bishop g4, dc, bishop takes c5, knight c3, rook c8, rook c1, bishop e7, and now quite clearly white already gets a pretty good play against the isolated pawn because black does not really have much of an attack. And now, in some previous videos, we looked at some ideas involving h3, bishop h5, knight h4, if we remember correctly. With the idea, if bishop takes e2, to do knight takes e2. But in this case, Petrosian didn't do that. Maybe because he was afraid of a move like d4, with some complications. So he just decided to play knight d4. Well, if he goes back on d7, which is maybe what he should do, white can maybe play bishop f3 and play knight e2, another defensive system that we've seen against the isolated pawn. So bishop takes e2, knight c takes e2, and now clearly white has a comfortable game because black has the isolated pawn, which is now more of a weakness simply because black does not really have much of an attack. So quite clearly black's trying to defend here. So black played queen d7, white played knight f4, putting pressure on the isolated pawn, rook fd8, and now white finds a new strategy of playing against the isolated pawn, and that is, well, queen d3 first to bring the rook in the game, knight e4, and now he decided to take on c6, which is a very interesting idea. It's an idea which we haven't seen in previous videos. It's a transition from a structure with isolated pawn into a structure with hanging pawns. And sometimes it's actually easier to play against hanging pawns because, as we'll see, okay, so if white plays here, I guess black can try to defend this position with a move like bishop f6, and okay, it's one weakness and there's a good chance he's able to neutralize it. But when we're dealing with hanging pawns, and white plays rook c2, now this c6 pawn for now becomes a little bit of a weakness, and white will be able to play rook fc1 and so on, and if black ever pushes this pawn, then the d5 pawn becomes weak. So bishop f8, rook fc1, queen b7, queen e2, rook e8, queen g4, and now, yes, so white's just simply putting a lot of pressure on black here. And now also the g7 is a little bit of a target. So g6, and now white goes back queen d1, threatening maybe queen d4. Bishop d6, and now black actually just blundered the tactic. So, I mean, maybe it was best to release the pressure, but then again, white can maybe take, and then he would try to go here, and then try to go knight d3, knight c5, try to blockade and control the c5 square, and this is like an outpost now. Black has no b pawn, so white just gonna have this constant pressure on the c pawn. And if ever black even plays d4, that won't necessarily help because this weakness on c6 is still there. So white would still be better. Maybe f6 was the best try, blocking the bishop. But he played bishop d6, an active move, and immediately it runs into a tactic. Knight takes, and now if he were to take here, the problem is white can go rook takes c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, queen takes c8, queen d4, and now mate is threatened on g7 or h8. And the only way I could see to defend mate is to play f6, and then we go queen takes d5 and win the knight, and white's going to be up 2 pawns with no compensation. So black had to just surrender the pawn, rook c d8, but now after rook takes c6, bishop b8, I mean black is hoping that, has vague hopes that there's going to be some complications because of the pin, but in reality white just has to be careful. And he played f4. I guess it stops bishop e5, and now the bishop on b8 became kind of irrelevant. And also white's idea he would have loved to go queen d4, but then he would run into bishop e5, which could be a little bit unpleasant, especially that this knight taking can run into bishop takes h2, perhaps. So he just played f4, rook e6, now queen d4, and black just simply resigned. So you saw how sometimes the idea of playing with isolated pawn could be actually transitioned to playing against hanging pawns. And in a lot of cases, it can actually improve your situation on being able to put pressure, because now you're potentially dealing with a couple of weaknesses. And if the hanging pawns are immobile, they become more of a even slight weakness. The next game we're going to look at is a game between Mikhalchishyn and Belyavsky, two strong Soviet grandmasters. And you'll see that this game is similar to the game we saw black won between Akiba Rubinstein and Nimzovich. But here, white showed how to play against this self-blockading structure, self-blockading plan. So knight c3, bishop e7, bishop f4 castles, e3, c5, so it's a normal queen's gambit position, dc, knight c6, cd, ed, bishop e2, bishop takes c5, castles, bishop e6, knight e5. So again, he realizes that at some point black might try to go d4 and equalize the game. And so he plays this interesting idea of knight e5. And now the idea is simple. If black, let's say he goes here, just to show you an example. So if black ever plays d4, now after this is not completely equal, because now black has some weaknesses, some isolated pawns. And because of that, black could be a little bit worse. Not to mention, of course, white has a concrete move like knight a4. But even if, let's say, that move did not exist, still the idea is d4 does not right away equalize because the pawn structure is still in white's favor. So that hanging pawn sometimes makes the position even more unbalanced than isolated pawns. So he played knight e5, black played bishop d6, and now you see the position is going to be very similar to the structure between Nimzovich and Rubinstein, where the dark squared bishops and the knights get traded. And now white played queen a4, quickly putting pressure on the hanging pawns. And very often, as you'll see, the queen is really well placed on f4 against hanging pawns, because it can't really be kicked away from here, and it keeps an eye on all the pawns to some extent. It's just a very nice active square for the queen. Sometimes also a3 is an active square, but as you saw in the previous game, black was able to go here, queen b4, and so sometimes that could be an idea against it. But after queen f4, let's say if you were to play queen b6, white can, let's say, play knight a4, play rook c1, and immediately start putting pressure on this pawn. So black decided that he had to play c5 and start making these pawns mobile. But now white played b3, so that's a very important move. Not allowing this self-blockading structure, weakening this pawn on b2. He played b3 right away to more or less fixate the pawns. So now, if black were to play c4, and white takes, this pawn on c4 now is becoming more of a weakness. Not to mention that white can potentially consider a move like b4, and now after he plays a3, this pawn is never a weakness, and now white will just have free pressure on this pawn on d5 without having to worry about this weakness on b2. So therefore, that's why the b3 move is a very important prophylactic move. And of course, if black ever plays d4, he has to count with a move like rook d1. So black tried to play queen a5, attacking the knight. White just simply played rook ac1, rook ac8, and now white wants to trade queens, queen a4, because after all, this queen is like stabilizes black's position and more or less protects black's pawns, so trading it off definitely is in white's favor. Black traded, because if he moves away, then this queen on a4 is also going to be very active. Takes, takes. And now he played c4. So he's thinking maybe he has chances because of the passed pawn, but as you'll see, this pawn becomes more of a weakness than a strength. Because it's easily blockaded and could be attacked many times. So white traded, and now knight c5. Very key move, threatening just to attack the bishop. Bishop d5, f3, rook c8, and now knight back to a4. So white's more or less consolidating. Bishop e6, e4, knight d7, king f2, knight b6, knight c3. So as you see, this bishop is still bad, and the pawn is being blockaded, and now white is going to bring the king in, and white has this free 4 and 3 advantage on the king side. f5, so black tries to chip away in the center, but after king e3, fe, white has an advantage because his pieces are more active, his king is more active, and black still has problems to solve. And white won the game in a very instructive manner. Rook b1, bishop d7, king d4, king e7, rook b4, just activating all of his pieces. Rook d8, trying to create desperate counterplay, but he just took on c4 because no discoveries are scary here. Bishop here, knight d5, knight takes ed, bishop takes g2, king e5, but now that king activity lets itself known. Rook d7, rook b8, and black just resigned because black has really no play here. And white has threats of rook g8, and then rook takes g7, and if king f7, d6, and black's just too passive. Even though material is equal, there's not much that black can do in this position. One more game I wanted to show you is that very often it's good to try to get hanging pawn position when we're trying to play for a win. So in this game, my coach Georgi Kachishvili was black against American, back then international master, now a very strong grandmaster, 2650 FIDE, I mean even higher, top 100 player in the world, American Samuel Shankland. And in this game, Sam Shankland was having a fantastic tournament. He was in first place, and Georgi Kachishvili was a full point behind, and he had to win with black in order to tie for first. So in this game, he chose a Sicilian defense, active opening, and he played this line with g6, which is very unbalanced. And white played a line trying to get an isolated pass pawn. And in this position, so quickly we got a position with isolated pawn. But as we already discussed, the problem with just having... Okay, so he played e6 first, stabilizing. Bishop g5. Maybe knight e5 was a little bit better. Bishop g5. Knight takes. And the thing is, yes, so now white wanted to take on d5, ed, and that structure would be almost impossible to win. So the best way to try to play for a win is to get hanging pawns. Why? Because if white cannot just get rid of the pressure, because if white ever just plays d5 to try to trade everything off, there's still going to be these two weaknesses like I mentioned before. So hanging pawns are much more unbalanced. So much more unbalanced than isolated pawns. With isolated pawns, very often you can just play d5 just to make a draw and trade everything off. But with hanging pawns, it's not easy to do. And white has to actually try to get initiative, but still, if you need to try to play for a win, you have to take some risks. So black played h6, bishop h4, b6, queen d3, bishop b7, and now maybe knight e5 again was principled to try to start attacking some weak squares. And then maybe white's a little bit better. But he played rook d1, rook c8, c4, queen d6, and bishop g3, queen b4, a3, and now the game gets very sharp. Queen a5, bishop d6, rook d8, bishop e7, rook d7, bishop e4, queen f5. And this is a very imbalanced position, which obviously offers black winning chances. Takes, knight e5, rook d8, d5, ed, and now white played into a combination, which he thought was working, but it turned out it's not that good. King takes f7, knight rook e7, king g6, here dc, and possibly he missed something in the complications, because here it turned out that black is actually already doing very well. And the rest was a matter of technique. I mean, it was not a perfect technique, but it was still a technique. Eventually, not without drama, black ended up converting the game. So even though this material is equal, but this c4 pawn is very strong, the rook is very active, and there's still some back rank issues. Here, rook a8, rook c5, rook takes, f3, rook b3, and black was able to consolidate his extra pawn. King f2, h5, king g3, rook b2. Here black was actually winning with knight e4, but there was heavy time pressure here, and eventually black was, after a very long game, eventually black won this game, maneuvering, and he was able to win and tie for first in this very important tournament. And like I said, how it was done? Well, it was by creating this imbalance of creating hanging pawns, and hanging pawns give much more opportunities to dynamics than, let's say, even isolated pawns, despite the fact that isolated pawns are also very unclear. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we'll be coming with the last part, how to play with and against hanging pawns, in the third video very shortly. Thank you. This has been Grandmaster Alex Lenderman signing off. Thanks. Take care.